In the final decades of the 19th century, the United States stood at the edge of a new era. Electricity, once considered mysterious and dangerous, was now powering streetlights, factories, and homes. Railroads stretched across the continent, cities grew upward and outward, and new technologies were changing how people lived, worked, and communicated. This period, marked by rapid industrial growth and scientific optimism, was also a time of reform. Across the country, people were rethinking long-standing institutions, education, labor, prisons, and even punishment. Many believed that society had a moral responsibility to evolve alongside its technological progress. Yet one major part of the justice system had remained largely unchanged: capital punishment. For centuries, executions in America had been carried out in public, with hanging as the dominant method. The condemned stood on a platform, a rope was tied around their neck, and at the pull of a lever the trapdoor opened beneath them. Theoretically, death was supposed to be instant, a quick, merciful break of the neck, but in practice it often went wrong. Some prisoners were too light, and instead of a quick death they strangled slowly, twitching and gasping for air. Others were too heavy, and the drop caused horrific injuries: broken jaws, crushed windpipes, even decapitation. In some cases, the hangman miscalculated the length of the rope, and the condemned fell awkwardly, causing prolonged suffering or botched outcomes that disturbed even hardened witnesses. These incidents didn't just raise moral concerns, they were becoming public scandals. Journalists began to report more critically on executions, describing them in vivid, unsettling detail. Physicians and clergy voiced growing discomfort. Politicians faced mounting pressure from both reformers and the public to modernize the process. Even more troubling was the fact that hangings, while carried out in the name of justice, often attracted rowdy crowds. People treated them like entertainment, gathering early, bringing children, cheering or jeering the condemned. In some towns, vendors sold food and drinks at the site of the gallows. What was meant to be solemn had become, in many cases, little more than a public spectacle of violence. These scenes didn't reflect well on a nation that prided itself on progress and order. How could the same country that had produced the telegraph, the telephone, and the electric light still rely on such crude and chaotic methods of punishment? In response to this growing concern, a conversation began to emerge, quietly at first, then more publicly. Could science offer a better solution? Could there be a method of execution that was quicker, more reliable, and less traumatic for everyone involved, both for the condemned and for the witnesses? The idea wasn't about ending the death penalty. It was about improving it, replacing chaos with control, pain with precision. For some, the answer was obvious: electricity. If it had the power to light entire cities, to run machines, to power the future, could it also provide a cleaner, more dignified way to carry out a death sentence? This was not a fringe idea. Scientists, physicians, and inventors began to explore the possibility seriously. They studied the effects of electrical currents on the human body. They conducted tests on animals and reviewed cases of accidental electrocution. They theorized that a properly controlled dose of electricity could cause instantaneous death with minimal pain. And so, as the century drew to a close, the United States found itself at a pivotal moment, a crossroads between tradition and technology, between the past and the future of justice. The gallows had defined the old era. The question now was whether the electric chair would define the next. In the summer of 1881, an unusual event unfolded in the industrial city of Buffalo, New York. An event that at first glance might have seemed like just another accident in a city quickly becoming defined by wires, machinery, and electricity. A man, drunk and unsteady, stumbled into an electric generator while wandering through a power station. Within moments he collapsed. He didn't cry out. He didn't convulse violently. He simply died, seemingly in an instant. Among those who heard of this strange and sudden death was Dr. Alfred P. Southwick, a dentist by profession and a mechanical thinker by nature. Southwick wasn't just a medical man. He was fascinated by machinery and the scientific advances of his time. Like many in his era, He saw electricity not just as a tool, but as a transformative force for the modern world. But where others saw danger or mystery, Southwick saw potential. The story of the man's death caught his attention. The swiftness of it, the quietness, the efficiency. It stood in stark contrast to the drawn-out horror of traditional executions. To Southwick, this accidental death suggested something radical, a new, more civilized way to carry out capital punishment. He began to ask questions no one else had asked before. If electricity could end a life so quickly, could it be controlled, harnessed, for use in state executions? Could the very energy that powered cities also bring death in a way that was clean, fast, and humane? Though the idea might seem morbid today, Southwick's motivation was in part humanitarian. He didn't want to glorify death. He wanted to reduce its suffering. He believed that if society insisted on the death penalty, then at the very least, it should be delivered with precision, dignity, and as little pain as possible. Southwick soon began to study the effects of electrical current on living organisms. He performed experiments on animals, measured voltages, and consulted with other physicians and engineers. He believed, based on his early findings, that a properly directed electric shock could cause death without physical mutilation or prolonged agony. As his research continued, so did his advocacy. He began publishing his findings, speaking with legal officials, and pushing the idea that electricity could be a safer, more humane replacement for the rope. Though controversial at the time, his arguments gained traction. He wasn't alone in believing that modern society needed a more scientific approach to justice. The idea that execution could be improved, made more efficient, less gruesome, fit perfectly into the era's belief in progress and reform through technology. Southwick is remembered today not just as a dentist or inventor, but as the father of the electric chair. His curiosity, sparked by a chance encounter with accidental death, would ultimately set in motion a chain of events that would reshape the way America carried out its most irreversible sentence. It all began with one man, one machine, and one moment that changed everything. By the mid-1880s, calls for reform in the American justice system had grown louder and more urgent. Across the country, headlines reported on gruesome executions gone wrong. Critics spoke out. The public, once captivated by hangings, was increasingly disturbed by what they saw. In New York State, officials could no longer ignore the problem. That same year, in 1886, Governor David B. Hill took a decisive step. He authorized the formation of a special commission to investigate alternatives to hanging, a sign that the state, at least, was ready to re-examine how it administered the death penalty. The goal of the commission was simple in theory, but difficult in practice. Find a method of execution that was more humane, more consistent, and more suited to a modern, civilized society. The group consisted of professionals from medicine, law, and science. Among them was Dr. Alfred P. Southwick, the Buffalo dentist who had been advocating the use of electricity for several years. Southwick now had a seat at the table. His idea, once considered radical, was now under serious review. The commission conducted a wide-ranging study. They examined execution practices in other countries. They reviewed reports from prisons. They consulted with physicians, engineers, and power plant operators. Again and again, they returned to the same question: could electricity really offer a cleaner alternative? At the time, electricity itself was still new and public understanding of it was limited. There were competing systems: direct current, DC, and alternating current, AC, each backed by powerful industrialists like Thomas Edison and George Westinghouse. There were ongoing current wars over which system was safer, cheaper, and better suited for public use. Ironically, it was this very conflict that helped push the idea of electrocution forward. Southwick and his supporters believed that alternating current was better suited for execution, capable of producing rapid, powerful bursts of energy. DC, in contrast, was seen as safer for everyday use. This argument was important because it also served a strategic purpose. It allowed Edison and others to argue that AC was dangerous, even deadly. As a result, AC-powered electric chairs could be used to prove that their competitor's system was lethal, while DC remained the preferred choice for lighting homes and businesses. Behind the scenes, science, industry, and justice were becoming strangely entangled. By late 1886, the Commission had reached a conclusion. Electricity, if properly applied, could serve as a viable replacement for hanging. The recommendation was bold. It would require new laws, new equipment, and entirely new procedures. It would also mark the first time in modern history that a government formally embraced electricity as a tool, not for life, but for death. And so, New York State prepared to take the next step, to become the first place in the world to legalize execution by electrocution. The search for a more humane death had reached a turning point. Now it was no longer a question of theory, it was a matter of policy, and soon, of practice. By the year 1888, momentum for reform had turned into action. Following the recommendations of the 1886 Commission, New York State moved swiftly and decisively. Legislators, after long debate and careful consideration, passed a groundbreaking law. Electrocution would replace hanging as the official method of execution in the state. It was the first law of its kind in the world. This decision wasn't made lightly. It was the result of years of study, mounting public discomfort with hanging, and the influence of key figures like Dr. Alfred P. Southwick, who had worked tirelessly to promote electricity as a modern, humane alternative. The law was passed with a clear goal: to reduce the suffering and unpredictability of traditional executions. It was meant to reflect the values of a nation entering the technological age, where science and reason would guide even the most solemn duties of the state. But putting the new law into practice would be far from simple. The electric chair did not yet exist in a practical, tested form. There were no blueprints, no instructions, just the idea that electricity, if used properly, could end life quickly and cleanly. So the state turned once again to experts. Engineers, doctors, and electricians were brought in to design a machine that could deliver a fatal jolt of current to the human body. The result was a large wooden chair, sturdy, ominous, and fitted with leather straps and metal electrodes. It looked like a strange blend of science and punishment, of progress and finality. The chair would be installed at Auburn Prison, one of New York's largest correctional facilities. The prison was equipped with a new electrical system, powered by alternating current, just as Southwick and others had recommended. But while preparations moved forward, many questions remained unanswered. How much voltage would be required to kill a person instantly? Where should the electrodes be placed? How long should the current be applied? Test runs were conducted on animals, primarily stray dogs, and observers took careful notes. These were grim, uncomfortable experiments, but they were seen as necessary. The goal was clear: avoid the cruelty and chaos of hanging, and replace it with something more clinical, more precise. As the chair took shape, so did the legal framework around it. The law specified that executions would now be carried out in private, with only authorized witnesses present. This was a deliberate shift away from public spectacles, an attempt to make capital punishment a more controlled, professional process. For supporters of the new law, this was progress. It was a sign that society could evolve, not just in its machines but in its morals. For critics, however, the electric chair was unsettling. It symbolized a new kind of power, one that could end a life with the flip of a switch. Still, the decision had been made. By 1888, New York had committed to a future in which death would be delivered not by rope and gravity, but by copper, current, and calculated design. The law was passed. The chair was built. Now all that remained was to use it. By 1890, the electric chair was no longer just a concept. It had been built, installed, tested. It waited, strapped down, wired up, polished and prepared for its first subject. That man was William Kemmler. Kemmler was a convicted murderer, found guilty of killing his common-law wife with a hatchet during a drunken argument. By all legal standards of the time, he was eligible for execution. But now, he would not face the gallows. He would be the first person in history to die by electrocution. The date was set, August 6, 1890. The location, Auburn Prison, in upstate New York. The world watched with uneasy anticipation. Legal challenges had come first. Kemmler's defense attorneys argued that electrocution was a cruel and unusual punishment, an untested method that could go horribly wrong. The case even reached the U.S. Supreme Court, but the justices ultimately upheld the state's right to proceed. Now the day had arrived. In the early hours of the morning, witnesses gathered in the execution chamber. Among them were prison officials, journalists, physicians, and engineers. The room was silent, but tense. No one knew exactly what to expect. Kemmler entered the room calmly. He was strapped into the chair, arms, legs, chest, and forehead bound tightly with leather straps. Electrodes were attached to his head and spine. A sponge soaked in saline solution was placed to help conduct the current. The room smelled faintly of metal and disinfectant. The switch was thrown. A jolt of 1,000 volts surged through Kemmler's body. His fist clenched, his body stiffened, his back arched. After about 17 seconds, the current stopped. At first, it seemed over, but then someone noticed movement, a low groan, faint breathing. Kemmler was still alive. Panic rippled through the room. Technicians scrambled to respond. The system had failed to do what it was designed to do. The current was turned on again, this time for over a minute. His body shook violently. The smell of burning flesh filled the air. One journalist would later say it was
an awful spectacle, far worse than hanging.
When it was finally over, doctors confirmed that Kemmler was dead. But the damage had been done, both to his body and to the public's perception of electrocution. Reactions were swift. Newspapers around the country criticized the event, calling it brutal, gruesome, and inhumane. Critics called it a botched experiment, a disgrace, and a scientific torture. Yet despite the controversy, New York officials stood by their decision. They insisted that the method was sound, that the failure lay in execution, not in the concept itself. They made adjustments, increased voltage, refined the procedure. Over time, more executions would follow, each one smoother than the last. The electric chair, despite its horrific debut, had arrived. It marked the beginning of a new era in American justice. Not cleaner, not necessarily more humane, but undeniably more modern. The age of the electric chair had begun. As the 20th century dawned, the electric chair, once a radical experiment, was becoming standard. Though its introduction had been rocky, the idea behind it remained appealing to many in power. A modern scientific death, hidden from public view, carried out by professionals, and delivered with the authority of the state. Over time, the electric chair spread beyond New York. One by one, other states adopted it, sometimes cautiously, sometimes eagerly. By the 1920s, more than 20 states had built electric chairs of their own. Each had its own execution chamber, its own setup, its own rules. But the principle was the same: death by electricity, managed behind closed doors. In 1924, however, a shift began. That year, Nevada executed G. John, a Chinese-American prisoner, not in a chair, but in a sealed chamber filled with cyanide gas. It was the first gas chamber execution in the United States. Nevada's experiment introduced a new phase in the ongoing search for better executions, methods perceived as more sanitary, more efficient, and more humane. Still, the electric chair remained dominant for decades to come. In the 1940s and 1950s, electrocution reached its peak. During this period, over 4,000 people were executed in electric chairs across the country. For many Americans, it became synonymous with the death penalty itself. Headlines mentioned Old Sparky and the hot seat with grim familiarity. State prisons like Sing Sing, New York, and Holman, Alabama, became known for the frequency of their executions. These were years of routine death, a cycle of appeals, final meals, last rites, and then the chair. But controversy never fully disappeared. Eyewitnesses occasionally reported gruesome details: prisoners who caught fire, who convulsed for too long, who smoked or bled during the process. Sometimes the execution required more than one jolt, raising old fears that electrocution wasn't as clean as promised. Behind the scenes, concerns grew among medical professionals, journalists, and human rights advocates. They questioned not only the electric chair itself, but the entire system surrounding it. Was death ever truly humane? And if not, could any method, electricity included, claim moral superiority? Then came another shift. In 1982, the state of Texas introduced something new: lethal injection. The first person executed by this method was Charles Brooks, Jr., convicted of murder. Unlike electrocution, lethal injection seemed clinical and calm: an IV in the arm, a series of chemicals, a slow fading away. No smoke, no burning, no physical trauma visible to observers. The transition began almost immediately. States that once relied on electric chairs began retiring them. Some stopped using them altogether. Others passed laws making lethal injection the default method, reserving electrocution only for prisoners who chose it, if such a choice was even available. By the end of the 20th century, the electric chair was in decline. It had served its purpose, its time, its symbolic role in American history. But it was being replaced, again, by a new method, driven by new science and a continued desire to make death more acceptable. And yet, questions still lingered. Was lethal injection really more humane, or just better hidden? Had anything truly changed, beyond the surface? For a century, the electric chair had stood as a symbol of justice, progress, punishment, and controversy. Now, as the 21st century approached, it faded quietly into the shadows. But its legacy, like the current that once powered it, still pulsed beneath the surface of America's long and complicated relationship with capital punishment. The electric chair now stands not just as a machine, but as a symbol, a relic, a question. In the 21st century, it has largely vanished from active use, replaced by lethal injection in nearly every U.S. state that still practices capital punishment. The same states that once proudly unveiled their electric chairs have since stored them away in back rooms and museum exhibits, or displayed them in prison archives, ghostly reminders of a justice system in flux. But the story isn't entirely over. In a handful of states, Alabama, South Carolina, Tennessee, Florida, the electric chair still lingers in law, if not always in use. Some inmates are given the choice: die by injection or by electricity. A choice between two very different kinds of death, shaped by different decades, different technologies, and different public attitudes. These rare modern executions by electric chair are met with immediate controversy. In 2018, Tennessee used the electric chair to execute David Earl Miller, marking one of the few such executions in decades. The image shocked the nation. Reports described sparks, smoke, the smell of burned flesh. It was as though time had reversed, dragging the public back to a darker, less certain era. At the same time, the modern method, lethal injection, has come under fire as well. Pharmaceutical shortages, botched executions, and ethical objections from drug manufacturers have all raised difficult questions. And so the cycle continues, from rope to wire to needle, and now perhaps toward uncertainty once again. Some states have responded by reviving old methods. Some talk of firing squads. Others have debated nitrogen hypoxia or new chemical protocols. But all of these methods, like the electric chair before them, are attempts to answer the same persistent, unsettling question. Can a state kill humanely? For many, the answer is no. Humanity and execution, they argue, are fundamentally incompatible. No method, no matter how advanced or clinical, can ever erase the moral cost of taking a life. For others, the debate is not moral but practical. They ask, can any system be trusted to carry out death without error, bias, cruelty, or political influence? The electric chair, once hailed as the peak of progress, is now used in documentaries and textbooks as a case study in hubris, technology wielded in service of death. Still, its legacy lives on. It sparked endless debates. It forced the public to confront uncomfortable truths about violence, punishment, and power. It represented an era that believed deeply in control, that even death could be managed, measured, improved. Today, as the conversation about capital punishment continues to evolve, the electric chair remains a quiet but powerful reminder. A reminder that justice in all its forms is not just about outcomes. It's also about the methods we choose, and what those methods say about us.